incidents, number of arrests, and is it an epicenter, as I had described North Reading as being a few moments ago. What I did was added full-time sworn to civilian dispatchers to civilians working for a police department. And I didn't put a column in there, but if you just jot these numbers down, I'll go through them very quickly. Acton has 43 full-time employees. Ashland has 31 full-time employees. Bedford has 41 full-time employees. Canton has 43 plus full-time employees. Foxborough has 45. Hanover has 51. Holliston has 25. Littleton has 29. Linfield has 26. Medfield has 23. Medway has 23 plus. Middleton has 17. Newburyport has 36. Northborough has 26. Norwell has 32. Reading has 52. Southborough has 21. Walpole has 47. Westwood has 39. Wilmington has 63. And North Reading has 31. So when you look at those numbers, we're right at the median, or just perhaps a little bit below. So so that, in my estimation, that throws that the accuracy of that benchmark when it comes to police department as grossly inaccurate. I asked when Greg arranged to have the author of the report come to a department head meeting, I asked him point blank, what kind of information did you use? And he explained that the information provided by the schools is extremely detailed, and that's required by Department of Education. So their accounting information and other information, their spreadsheets are huge. And he said the information that they glean for municipalities comes from Department of Revenue requirements that are not as detailed and as comprehensive, but by virtue of what's required. So that's comparing apples to oranges. Another thing that I noticed in the benchmarking study was that they broke out very nicely revenues received by the schools. For example, they listed their grants, they listed fees received, and so on and so forth. And I asked them, I said, did you account for the fact that the North Reading Police Department receives about $200,000 in reimbursements per year? No, didn't account for that. And that's our Quinn bill reimbursement and community policing grants and so on and so forth. That's not accounted. It was counted as revenue, but they didn't offset that with the reimbursements coming back. Details had a huge impact. The year they used in North Reading was 2005. That was right at the apex of the Route 62 project, and we were averaging about 100 to 150 details per week during that period of time. And the average community in that benchmark study was averaging about 50 details per week, and those revenues were counted against the police department. Another area of inaccuracy, and I don't have a clue where we get the information, but he was, for example, he said the maximum pay, base pay for a lieutenant was $97,000, and in fact it's not. It's around $85,000. So that's a $12,000 inaccuracy. So he was taking numbers and dividing them into other numbers and coming up with these inaccurate figures, and it's and the fear I had is that there is a movement afoot in the community to say, listen, the police department has the luxury of having X number of cops over their peer groups, and we don't. In the reality of it, we're below, in my estimation, we're below the median when it comes to personnel, based upon the numbers we just calculated out. And if you look at that report, look at some of the unique characteristics of North Reading. For example, with the number of bar rooms, restaurants, and retail stores that one of their purveys is alcohol, North Reading ranks 5th. We're 5th from the top of that, and that's putting us up against some of these smaller cities that are part of this. So that makes it a unique and historic. I love the history of this town because it's been like that forever. Since the town was incorporated, we've had barrooms, so that's
Right. I can remember a couple of significant ones when I first moved into town.
It's certainly part of our long and glorious history as a community, but it is unique to North Reading that we're kind of maxed out on, almost maxed out on the allowable permits, and that does have an impact on what happens in our community. And other things, such as high density, that HD under high-risk locations is high-density housing. Ashland is a fairly good-sized community. It has 3,000 units, but we're approaching that. We're going to be approaching, we're probably at around 1,000 units right now. And
we're going to have 406 very shortly. In fact, I was going to ask you a question associated with that. Beginning this calendar year, we should see some occupancy later in the year, and that's going to not necessarily have impact this year, but in a future year, there potentially will be some impacts.
Well, I think of the departments, I think fire and police will have the most immediate impact, just by nature of high-density living. It just things happen, and it's just loud music and your neighbor's next-door apartment. That generates a disturbance call and requires 2 police officers to go there and to quell that disturbance, and that's 2 man-hours that we didn't account for. There are other things in North Reading that make it unique. We have Concord Street, which is loaded with trucking terminals. That generates hijacking potentials. It generates a lot of larceny. Stuff ripped off the back of the trucks, and also the potential for major labor disputes. We have the same thing with the postal annex. That's kind of a negative impact on the town because we don't generate any income from that on the tax side, as far as I know, and yet it does present a burden to police and fire with the kinds of calls that we respond to there. There's a lot of domestic issues there. There's a lot of labor issues, and there is certainly a lot of hazmat issues that we responded to, probably maybe 5 or 6 per year, where an envelope goes through and it sets their alarms off, and the police and fire have to respond to that, and that's extremely labor intensive. And one of the unique things, I think, is only probably 8 of those across the state, those distribution centers. So it's North Reading is unique amongst that. And we have nursing homes. We have a lot of group homes in the community that present problems. So North Reading is a small community that has unique problems associated with larger communities. So that benchmarking study, as far as I can see, has done a tremendous injustice to the image of this department and the services we provide to the community. So I guess hope that the Finance Committee and the board take into consideration our observations of that study and adjustments made.
Well, before we go on with the detail, I'd just like to commend you and your staff for pulling this information together, because it certainly does help in terms of understanding the information that has been presented in the benchmarking report.
Thank you.
And it will be taken into account.
I appreciate that.
Yes, sir, Mr. Jones.
I'll answer it like a politician. In this area, it's typical. Reading, Wilmington, Stoneham, Wakefield, North Reading, because of the uniqueness of our location, we have a problem that is higher than other parts of the state, particularly when it comes to addictive drugs like heroin. We actually had an incident last night with a crack addict. Was it Kitty's last night? It was a prostitution kind of an event, but it was a crack addict. Coming off of Craigslist from Florida and up here making rounds. So because of our proximity to these highways, that's the kind of stuff that we see more often than other communities that are isolated, and many of our benchmark peer group communities are isolated communities. They're a long way from cities and major highways and stuff. So it's typical to this area, but not so for the rest of the state. Both. Yeah, we had an interesting interesting meeting with the chief of police from Woburn, Phil Mahoney. Phil came over to see Chief Purnell a couple of years ago, and knocked on the chief's door, and I was asked to come in. And Phil turned to Hank, and he said, "Chief, your kids are killing my kids." And you know, it took Hank by surprise. And what he was referencing is that we had a significantly high number of dealers in heroin that were living in North Reading that were purveying their goods to kids in Woburn. And it's stereotypically, the stereotypical belief was that it should have been the opposite way. And in fact, it was kids from this town that were dealers. And in that period of time, actually Woburn gave us 2 or 3 unmarked cars to use because they wanted us to become more involved in intelligence gathering and regional drug task forces and so on, which we did. But what we found is that there was a hidden aspect to that, in that we had probably 50 armed robberies that year that went unreported. You know, we'd find out about it through interviewing this person, interviewing this family, where somebody would knock on the door to a young prospective dealer who was given product to sell without paying for it up front, and would turn around and sell their product and become addicted themselves and use the profit they made to feed their own habit. And then the dealer, the larger dealer, would come to them with a gun or a knife and threaten them and their family that you better pay up. And that happened 50 times in 1 year. And that's going back about 3 years ago. But we've seen that begin to tail down somewhat. So as I mentioned earlier, we, through our aggressive programs, you know, our tertiary programs, are beginning to get a grip on that right now. But the fear is that it's still out there. We still have, you know, once you're an addict, you're always an addict. And I've only heard 2 successful stories of kids in this town that have had long-term good reports that they haven't returned to using. But the vast majority are still using. So our concern is that we don't want to lose that edge we have right now with this problem. And we're also confronted with we know that methamphetamines are coming, because if you follow the papers up in New Hampshire, there are a lot of clandestine laboratories that are being taken down almost on a weekly basis in the rural areas of New Hampshire. So, you know, sooner or later it's going to hit here like an epidemic, and because it's cheaper than heroin, and the junkies will find some way to either offset their they'll call it an 8-ball. It's just what they call an 8-ball. Typically an 8-ball is heroin and cocaine, but what they'll do is they'll mix heroin and methamphetamines and become polyaddicted. But that changes the dynamic from historically junkies are somewhat non-violent. You know, they'll pull robberies but use a toy gun. They'll break into somebody's house, steal money. Or they'll go into a store and they'll shoplift for consumable goods like baby formula and diapers and those kind of things. And they'll take them up and sell them in these cities that are nearby to feed their habits. But what we're finding is that the folks that are addicted to methamphetamines or stimulant drugs are violent. And you'll see the violent robberies, you'll see the stabbings, you will see the shootings. And we suspected that stabbing that took place outside of on the Postal Distribution Center's property last summer had some drug ramifications to it. And that was a multiple stabbing that took place there that night. So we do see these things in our community from time to time. That was a short answer.
Let's move on to the budget. But thank you for the well-prepared presentation.
As we look at the personnel services, if you look under the you know, our level services is $2,700,000 thereabouts, and our additional requests, I take exception with that, too.